Merci. Merci et bonjour. Et je suis désolée, mais je ne parle pas français très bien, so this will have to be in English. I know that my last name sounds like I should speak French, and it's awesome because I actually did a lot of research. I've spent the weekend on the island, or just over in Ile d'Orléans, and most of my ancestors come from this city. So it feels really neat to be what I feel like home. And the reason that I was able to find that was because people were considerate enough to leave artifacts that I could go and then trace my genealogy. And in a lot of ways, that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about proactive things that we can do in the moment right now that will make the lives of people who touch our code later easier. We will leave artifacts of our thinking. And we call this act empathy. And a lot of times when we think of the word empathy, we think of feelings, right? But empathy is not just a feeling. Empathy is a skill. It is a skill that you can learn. It is a skill that you can teach people on your team. And it is absolutely critical to building software. So I'm going to start off with a story. When I was in high school, there was this guy. His name was Scott. And Scott was president of the computer club. He was amazing and very much a geek, and nobody was surprised when he went and got his degree in computer science. What did surprise me was that 10 years later at our high school reunion, he approached me to be the CEO of his startup. He said that he had been reading my blog for a few years, and I had been talking about communication and how important it is to connect to your audience. And he said, I am not good with people, but I really love building software, and I really want to build software in this particular way, and I think that if I had you on my team, I could help you, we could do things together. And my response was, that's nice, Scott, but I'm not technical. I don't know anything about software. And I really felt at the time that there were people who were good with machines, and then there were people who were good with people. And Scott told me something that was very profound. He said, you're a developer, but you don't even know it yet. Because the way that you think about communications, I've seen it in your writing. You think about things in algorithms and patterns, and that is all that it is to code. So I believe in you, and I think we could do great things together. He also told me that the world of software was changing, that the goal was now just as much on people as it was on the bits and bytes and the ones and zeros that were going into our computer. And so he convinced me that together we would do amazing things. And so I said yes. And then a few years later, Scott asked another question, and I said yes again. So if anybody in the audience is single, I'll give you 51% of my startup was a really great pickup line that worked for me. But here's the thing. Had I not fallen in love with this guy, I probably would have quit. Because it is that hard to get people who understand people and people who understand machines to work together. This is not an easy problem. But luckily, we have 1,000 really smart people in this room who can help fix it. I didn't quit. And together, we created Corgi Bytes. Our tagline is old code, new tricks, which is kind of fun. And what we do is we transform slow, sluggish, sloppy systems. You can tell I'm a writer, I love alliteration, into code that generates more revenue, reduces operational costs, and reduces risks because security vulnerabilities are a really big thing. And the reason that we're able to do this is because we have a very, very strong focus on empathy and communication. It is at the very heart of our organization. And everyone in our organization is an excellent communicator and also codes. My administrative assistant is learning how to code. Every single developer on our team has training in empathy. Because what Scott and I learned is that it's not about people who code over here and people who speak to other people over here. It's about all of us embracing the wholeness of who we are. So that's what we're going to talk about today is empathy. And the reason that I'm giving this talk is because every single empathy talk I've given or I've heard, it feels like empathy is supposed to be an intuitive skill. But it's not. I got my degree in marketing. Marketing is really all about the understanding of how to understand people. I got 4 years of training in empathy and communications, just like Scott got a 4-year degree in computer science. Empathy is a skill. You're going to hear me say that over and over and over again. So today we're going to talk about what is empathy. We're going to go through a few definitions, and we're also going to show you kind of what we use at Corgi Bites. We're also going to talk about why empathy matters and what happens if you ignore empathy on a team. Here's a spoiler. It's not good. And also, we're going to take a look and go through kind of a mini exercise on how to actually execute on this and how you can train your teams to act upon empathy. So you guys ready? Excellent. All right, so the first, what is empathy? I love this quote by George Lakoff. George Lakoff is a cognitive linguist, which is the coolest title for a job I think that I've ever heard. But he says that empathy is at the heart of real rationality. You cannot make a decision about something that's going to impact another person without understanding their point of view. So for those people in the room or those people on your team who are like Scott and say, oh, I'm not good with people, I don't get empathy, this is a great quote, right? Because empathy can be just as analytical and just as cognitive as it is a feeling state. So big plug for Indy Young, who's a friend of mine, and she wrote the book called Practical Empathy, which is essentially the technical manual on how to use empathy on your team. Highly recommend reading it, getting copies of your team. It goes into a lot of really juicy detail on some of the stuff we're going to touch on today. And in that book, she defines empathy as a skill that is developed by listening and perspective taking. So the first step is really gathering data and understanding what that person wants. And then there's a second step. There's an action. It is applied by perspective taking. So these are two separate things. First, you listen and understand, you research, and then you take an action. She also goes on to describe 6 different types of empathy, which I didn't know that there were 6 different types of empathy. And I think just the fact that we can categorize empathy in 6 different ways shows us that empathy is way more technical and there is way more research around it than just, oh, have a good feeling and think of somebody else and be in their shoes. So we're going to go through these relatively quickly. The first is mirrored empathy. We all have mirror neurons in our brains that tell us how to fit into a social group. I was taught a skill when I was in sales, and that skill is body language. I was taught that if I wanted to make someone feel more comfortable in a setting, I would adopt the same body posture that they had. So if someone was standing there open and relaxed, I would pay attention to that, and I would adopt an open and relaxed body posture as well. Because doing that automatically triggers the mirror neurons, and it helps build rapport. This is an example of a skill that I was taught to trigger that mirrored empathy. Next is emotional empathy, which is sometimes referred to as affective empathy in the literature. And this is that feeling of losing yourself, sometimes in a character or a book or in a story or with a friend. It's about really kind of allowing yourself to feel what somebody else feels. And then you can take an action upon that. And when you take that action, that's called empathetic concern. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Over the weekend, I saw that a few of my friends who are transgender were really upset about something that had come out recently over the weekend. And I care about my friends, and so I listened to what they had to say. I felt that concern, and then I decided to act by making a donation to a cause that would help them. Another example is the bed and breakfast that I stayed at over in Ile-d'Orléans. It was so cute. And the guy really loved, like I could just tell it was his passion and this was his heart, his work. I felt that concern. I felt that he really, really cares about what he's doing. So then I'm going to take the step of writing a review for him on TripAdvisor so more people can find it. Right? It's that feeling, but then taking an action is empathetic concern. Personal distress. I struggle with horror movies. I struggle with those blooper reels where people constantly get hurt. That's because it puts me into personal distress. Seeing too much of this, and some people are more sensitive than others, but seeing this, it triggers a pain in us. Self-empathy. This one is my favorite. Self-empathy is taking all of these different practices and turning them inward. It's about learning how to self-care. It's about learning how to put yourself and giving yourself just as much empathy and care as the people around you, which is something I really struggle with. Mindfulness is a really, really big part of this, mindfulness and meditation. And then we have cognitive empathy, which is the focus of Indy's book and the focus of what we're going to talk about today. And cognitive empathy is purposefully discovering the underlying thoughts and emotions behind someone else's behavior. It is a rational and analytical process. I sometimes get asked, when I first started exploring interest about working and talking about empathy, the biggest piece of pushback that I got was, Andrea, you can't talk about empathy on stage because there are people who have autism and they can't access empathy. And so some of you might be thinking that, and I would challenge you, because all of the people that I've talked to who are active in the autism communities say this is not true. In fact, in an interview with Martin Lund, who runs the program Agile for Autism, which uses agile principles to help children with autism work with change and navigate different areas of their life, he teaches cognitive empathy. So I think that it is a disservice to the people, to really anybody, to stereotype them and to assume that this is something that they can't access. So with all of this, the way at Corgi Bites that then we describe empathy to our team to make it a little less feeling and a little more of kind of these are the things that we're trying to get you to do is that empathy is two things. It's proactive perspective taking, right? So you're not being reactive. You're thinking about things ahead of time. You're thinking about how can I serve people ahead of time, right? And then it's also problem solving. So it's thinking about problems before they've become fires that you have to put out. Why does empathy matter? So empathy is the fastest way to build trust on a team. How many people in here would think that trust is a really important part to building software? Hopefully everybody's hand goes up. The challenge becomes, how do we actually build that trust on our team? What I found in my team is that teaching my staff about empathy has rapidly built trust. One way to think about this was, Corgi Bites started really getting known for working on legacy code. And Michael Feathers, for whom I have tremendous respect, he, in his book, Working Effectively with Legacy Code, describes legacy code as code without tests. And while I think that is accurate, I'm not sure it's complete. So I started thinking about what are some other ways that we can think of legacy code. It's code without trust. Legacy code is code that we don't trust what the system is doing. We don't trust the documentation that we're referring to. We don't trust the other members of our team, perhaps, to give us a complete picture. We don't trust the tests, maybe. Why don't we trust things? Because it's code without context. If we look at archaeology, for example, one of the most important things for being able to identify a certain artifact or element is context. We don't understand and we don't have access to the reason that that decision was made. And when we don't have access to that, we have to make assumptions. And when we act on assumptions, we tend to not go the right way. So if we don't have context, how can we make sure that we're going to have context? Code without communication artifacts. And going back to that idea of archaeology a little bit, you know, the difference between brownfield and greenfield is that with brownfield, you don't have a lot of those communication artifacts. You have to maybe build them. So I think if we use the analogy of archaeology, I love Michael Feathers' definition that it's code without tests. And we can think of that as if we were to stumble on an archaeological dig, right? If we're going into a legacy code base that is sloppy and slow. Tests are like bones. They can tell us a lot on their own. And there are also a lot of other things that we'll go through a little bit later in the presentation that can give us added context about what this system is doing. So in an archaeological sense, that might be writing, right? Thank heavens that the Canadian, especially Quebecois people, were so diligent about birth and baptism records because I was able to then trace back my ancestry all the way to the 1640s here. Pottery, right? We might think of that as the way that we name our variables, the way that we make our code self-revealing. We also have different tools, right? So DevOps, the architecture of our systems, is that self-revealing? Are we creating ways that, we can execute our code very quickly? Coins, right? That might be the external documentation, right? And how closely can we tie that to our code base? So, for example, if you've got a coin, but it's way out of context over here in a different area of the world, it may not tell you as much, but if you've got it really, really close on your archaeological dig, then it can give you a lot of context. And that's the same way with our commit messages, that's the same way with our pull requests. The closer it is tied to the code base, the closer our documentation is coupled with our code base, it makes it easier for people to go and find out what that rationale was. So the idea is, are we intentionally leaving these types of artifacts behind so that people can get a sense of what our thinking was? And I asked this question in London at the Extreme Tuesday Club, which is so much fun. They've been running this for about 20 years in London. And I love what Sleepy Fox said. He said, write a few Post-it notes, she said. And I just had people go through an exercise where they thought about all the different types of communication artifacts that go into a software project. And very quickly, lots of ideas came up. There are a lot of places where natural language, where our needing to talk to humans just as much as machines, surfaces in the software that we build. The next step was to take those and group them. And there are many different ways that you can group them, and I'll go through a couple that kind of surfaced out of this exercise. So the first is, can you see it? Obvious and not obvious, right? So what are the things that you think about really quickly? And then you've got synchronous and asynchronous, right? So the obvious kind of synchronous events would be video chats or face-to-face meetings. The synchronous events that you may not think of immediately would be eye contact or whether or not you're punctual, right? Your body language. Asynchronous are things that don't happen right at the same time, right? So the obvious ones would be text messages, Slack, Twitter, email. The not so asynchronous one would be scenarios or tests or leaving a commit message. Another way that you can group these is you've got in the source code repository up at the top and not in the source code repository at the bottom. And then you can also say what are the things that are terse and what are the things that are verbose. What are the things that you can say in maybe a sentence or two? What are the things where you need a longer form, maybe a report or a paragraph or at least a few paragraphs to really tell a story? And organizing things in this way, and whatever way makes sense for you and your team, can help you identify the very specific communication artifacts that are going to be most useful for you on your team. This happens to be the chart that we use at Corgi Bytes. Every single artifact that you deliver or your team delivers builds trust. I talk to a lot of software developers who are really nervous about documentation because they don't want to over-document, and that's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about is the idea that every piece of communication builds a small piece of trust. Brené Brown, who we're going to hear a lot about later, she researches empathy, blame, and shame. She describes trust as a marble jar. And when you first meet someone, you might have a few marbles in your jar. If I came up and said hi to anybody here, we'd have a few because we've got some common interests, right? But then I need to interact with you to understand, the things that you deliver on a promise or you do something that helps me build trust, right? That adds marbles to the jar. If you do something where you don't build trust, that takes marbles away. And this is a really good kind of visual to think about how trust exists within each other. And the really neat thing about empathy is that it creates trust fission. And fission is an amazing phenomenon. You take one particle and it splits into many. And then you get another particle that comes off of that and it splits into many as well. Those of you who have studied nuclear fission know that this is a really amazing way to generate a massive amount of energy very quickly, which is part of the reason why I have to be careful in using it, right? So you can think of this as an initial communication artifact. Trust is the byproduct. When you've gone through the exercise of using empathy to develop a piece of communication that is going to be useful to a specific person, that builds trust. And when that person then does that same exercise, it builds trust among the team. And all of a sudden, trust starts happening and trust starts forming. Now, about that documentation, during this process, we're proactively thinking about constraints and validating our needs and the needs of other people. So this makes sure that we're not producing kind of more documentation than is really necessary. So let's talk a little bit about what happens if we decide to ignore empathy. The first thing that develops is a strong hero culture. Why is that bad? I love this by Daniel Kimball. This is a LinkedIn post he wrote. And I think this is the most concise way that I've seen a hero culture described. A hero culture is addictive. The people who feel like heroes need to stay heroes. The sad thing is that not everyone can be a hero. By definition, a hero is somebody who stands out amongst the crowd. Heroes also hide deeper problems and inevitably create burnout. They spawn information hoarding. So in order for me to maintain my hero status, I can't share what I'm working on with other people. So I do turf building. Heroes disempower, and they definitely don't scale. So what are some ways that a hero culture might form, right? It's having empathy for the heroes and rewarding those heroic acts. Some of which might be, are you rewarding the people who stay late and work overtime? Are you rewarding the people who don't take vacation and sacrifice their family? Or don't ask for help or decide they want to work for loan? Because if you do this, you generate a culture where it is seen as heroic to fight fires rather than to prevent them. Anytime I see a ninja or 10x developer on a job request, that's a signal to me that that's a hero culture. Next is shame and blame. Brené Brown, one of my favorite authors, her work has dramatically impacted my life for the better. This book, Daring Greatly, became a national bestseller, and she showed the world that shame is something that we don't have to be afraid of. She talks about vulnerability very much in this book. And there's a new book that she just came out called Dare to Lead, which talks about using these principles as a leader. And in her TED Talk, she says vulnerability is the birthplace of innovation, creativity, and change. But what prevents that trust and vulnerability from forming? We all agree that trust is something that we want on our teams. But what is it that we're doing that's preventing us from getting there? The first is shame, which Dr. Brown describes as the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. If we create a hero culture on our team, that means the people who aren't heroes aren't going to feel like their contributions matter. That creates shame. Shame thrives on three critical elements: secrecy, silence, and judgment. Open, transparent, empathetic communication drowns this out. Shame cannot survive when it is doused with empathy. Woo. Blame. When we feel shame, it is an intensely painful feeling. A feeling that we sometimes feel like we need to discharge onto other people. When we do that, we enter into blame. This is so baked in to our developer culture that when I want to run a command to see the history of who changed something in the source code, what command do I run? Anybody? Git blame. This is very baked into our culture. And if we're going to address that, we need to address this. On our team, we've aliased that to Git history, which is a much more neutral term. And I could go into kind of the cognitive bias reasons why. But essentially, if you're running Git blame, you are priming yourself to blame the other people on your team. So a specific act that you can do is to change it to something more neutral. How do we prevent blame and shame? I've kind of given it away already. Empathy. So Dr. Brown in her research has shown that empathy is the number one kind of antibiotic or killer of shame and blame. So if you have a toxic culture and you want to change it, douse it with empathy. Next thing that happens if we ignore empathy, we get a lack of diversity. A McKinsey study came out, and hopefully this isn't a surprise to anybody, but diversity is really good for business. The companies that have more diverse teams with gender and ethnic diversity are more profitable. It's just good for business. But unfortunately, women and minorities remain underrepresented. Achieving our diversity and inclusion goals requires us to think about other people. People who may not have been in the room when an idea was formed, but if we want to include them and make them feel welcome, we need to understand them first, reach out and talk to people and ask what they need, and then act upon that. So in your teams, if you find yourself in a very homogeneous type of group, think of the people that you are overlooking. Thinking of, women maybe, people of color, people with disabilities, parents, people in the LGBTQ+ community, people who are rising out of poverty, and anyone else that you specifically want to add to your team. I love this tweet by Sarah May, and she says it's not that, Agile and extreme programming, they came from a homogeneous team that tended to be on the upward side of power dynamics. And it's not that that's bad, but it's that if we never think about the other people who need to be included, then we're going to be stuck and we're not going to be as competitive. And the last is bias. Bias becomes really important when we start thinking about AI. And we start thinking about machine learning and taking our algorithms to scale. So Roman Yampolsky talks about how any time that you have a data set of humans, you're going to have bias. We have bias. It's not that it's necessarily a bad thing, but it's a bad thing if we don't try to discover more and guard against it. Here are some examples of bias in machine learning and AI. So in Pokemon Go, there are fewer Pokemon in black neighborhoods. Might not seem like that big of a deal, but to the people who play Pokemon, it is, right? You're further segmenting that group. On LinkedIn, they've since fixed this, but on LinkedIn, they had it where highest paying jobs were only shown to men, they weren't shown to women. How is it that women are supposed to get ahead and apply for those jobs if they don't know they exist and they're not being targeted? Google, when they first launched some fake recognition, the faces of black people showed up as gorillas. Not good. And this gets even worse when we start thinking about crime prediction or credit, things that absolutely impact somebody's life. And McKinsey then goes on to cite, this is in a separate study, but talking about just like we do retrospectives, where we think of kind of post-mortem of what went well, what could be better, what should change, the best way to guard against bias is to do a pre-mortem, to actively think about all of the different groups and to guard against that in your algorithm. What does that sound like? Empathy. As people who build software, it is our responsibility to identify potential bias in our systems. This is not something that we can send off to management or just plan on the CEO. We are building these systems, and we need to get a very clear understanding of how our humanness acts at scale. Sometimes it's great. Sometimes it's not so great. And the important thing is that we're figuring out what it is that we can change. There are two amazing books that you can dive deep on this topic. Technically Wrong by Sarah Wachter-Bacher, and also Weapons of Math Destruction by Kathy O'Neill. Highly recommend both of them. All right, so we've looked at kind of what empathy is, why it's important, and what happens if we ignore it. Let's start getting into the really nitty-gritty of how we use empathy on a technical team. So I started thinking first about, we've got blank-driven development, domain-driven development, test-driven development, behavior-driven development. So if test-driven development can essentially be distilled down into red-green refactor to help you remember that these are the actions that you need to take, empathy-driven development can be distilled into audience and action. So two things to remember. audience, and action. We're going to go through this a little bit on a more technical level. So for your audience, you essentially have 3 components. You want to narrow down to a very specific individual that is going to be the target of that message. Next, you want to consider the context. Remember, we talked about context in archaeological dig. How is this person thinking or acting or feeling? And then what is it that they need to solve that problem? So we'll go through this a little bit. So the first is to identify the individuals. Sam Horn is a brilliant communicator. I highly recommend picking up her books. Tung Fu, Pop, Stand Out in Any Crowd. And she just recorded a course on LinkedIn of communication. She's one of my mentors, and she's one of the people who really taught me about communication. And she taught me, and I learned this in my marketing classes as well, that if you're going to write, you cannot write for a group. In order for empathy to be triggered, you need to connect to an individual. So in this audience area, the first thing we do is we think about the audience as a group, and then we narrow it down to an individual. Preferably an individual that we know and that we've interacted with and that we can connect with. That's the absolute best. Sometimes that's not feasible, so sometimes personas might come into play. But if you've got user researchers on your team, this is where they do a really, really great job, and this is where they become incredibly valuable. So you can think of this, Sam Horn calls this the empathy telescope. Right, and remember how we talked about self-empathy? We can think of starting with ourselves. We need to have self-empathy. We need to consider our own needs. And then we can kind of grow out. So at the top of this, we've got different groups, right? So you might think, okay, I need to connect with my coworkers, or I need to connect with the industry at large, or I need to connect with stakeholders, or, you know, that's a great place to start, but that's not going to get you to empathy. You've got a second step to do. Consider the individual. Who is the individual that is going to represent that group that you are going to write to, that you're going to create this communication artifact for? You know, on your team, it might be your pair partner, you know, or somebody that you work with regularly, or somebody who's reviewing your PRs, right? On customers, it's very common to have a persona, right? Or you might have video interviews that you could at least see and kind of make a connection to that person. You might have coworkers, business analysts, product owners, HR people, right? And then stakeholders. You've got your CFO, your CEO. And it becomes a little bit more challenging as you move out to make that connection, but it's not impossible, right? And this is where you can rely on research, and research from, you know, your UX department or people like Indy who do this for a living. Next up, after you've identified your individual, is to consider the context. Right? If I'm interacting with an application that where I'm just kind of relaxed and, you know, I'm not really stressed about time, my experience and my needs are very different than when I'm with my 3-year-old and she's throwing a temper tantrum in the grocery store, right? And so considering the context in which this communication artifact is going to be created becomes incredibly important. So some questions to ask yourself is, what's happening in this person's environment? How are they feeling? What are they likely to do, and what have they tried in the past? You might say that you don't know, which calls null, essentially. If you don't know, that's a signal that you need to do some research, right? Doing this based on assumptions is what creates that bias in our system. Right? Next 3 is to define their needs. So what is their preference? You know, how do they like to receive information? What does success look like to them, and what's going to reduce their stress? Again, if you don't know, do the research. In her book, Indy Young describes listening sessions, which are ways that you can actually sit down with somebody and uncover what their needs are. So very quickly, I'm going to kind of go over what she talks about in her book, which is how to gather some of this data. So for a listening session, the first step is that you want to help the speaker feel really comfortable, right? Avoid shame and criticism. We've already talked about how that's not useful. Your job is to just listen. It's also, the goal is not to get feedback. The goal is to understand the deeper processing that's going on behind the scenes, right? So asking those questions, and there's many more in her book, about why do you act the way you do? What is it that kind of causes you when you're under stress? How would that eliminate that? It's not to give feedback as to whether your product is good or bad. When you're conducting these listening experiments, there are 3 things that you want to listen for. You want to listen for reasoning, so the reasons why somebody's doing what they're doing, reactions, and then also guiding principles. What are the values, those really deep-seated values that make somebody want to do what they do? Let the speaker lead the conversation. This is about them, not about you. And a little bit of silence is okay. There's going to be peaks and valleys throughout this process of listening. And that's okay. You kind of will have high-level topics where you're talking about things very broadly, and then you'll go down really deep. And that's normal. Some things that you want to avoid are asking feeling questions, especially in a work setting, because that can make somebody feel a little off-putting. It can feel a little bit more like a therapy session rather than a research session. It's about asking about proposed solutions. That's something that you might not want to do. That's kind of a separate thing. Right now, it's about uncovering what the problem is and what are those values. Making assumptions. We've talked over and over again about how that's not the best use of our time and resources. Using the word I. Again, this is about them, not about you. Switching topics quickly. It can be a little jarring. Shame, blame, name-calling. Hopefully no one does that in a user experience interview. And then also injecting your own opinion. This is about listening on a very deep level. So some ways that you can kind of explore this intent if you do sit down for a listening session is thinking about, what were you thinking when you made that decision? Tell me more about that. What was going on in your head, or what was going on in your mind, and how did you react? All right, so we've got our chart again, and I put the wrong one in there. We'll go through real quick to get to the last one. Oh, okay. All right, so the next is going to be, what's the best action? All right, so now we're in the action. We had done the audience section, where it was individual context needs. Now we're going to be talking about best action, most feasible action, and then what are the specific artifacts that we're going to create. All right, so the best action. We're thinking through, what's the ideal solution? What is the best quality thing that I could possibly produce to solve this problem? Right? What would have the biggest impact or be of the most value? And then, if you had no constraints, what action would you take? We're not done, because we need to go through a little bit of a feasibility analysis. It's great to brainstorm and think about the pie in the sky, but we are under real deadlines. We have money, we have time, and those are real constraints. So thinking through, what is maybe the best thing that I could do given my constraints, right? You might be under pressure to, have a big release. And as much as you would like to create this, full-blown API, it's just not going to happen today. So what's the next best thing that can get you a little bit further along? And then finally, you create the artifacts that come out of this analysis. And you don't wrap up a task until you have documented these small things, right? And when the communication artifacts are complete, then your task is done, right? So technical empathy, or empathy-driven development, whichever you choose to call it, it might feel slow and burdensome and like a lot of energy at first. And those are the exact things that I hear about test-driven development, right? Is that it can feel really slow. But guess what? This is a skill. The more you practice, the more intuitive this process becomes, right? So let's look at an example. All right, so here's our little chart, right? So we've got the audience, so we've got individual context and needs, and then we also have the best action, feasibility, and what artifacts we need to create. So we start and we think through and we're like, okay, I need to write an error message. That's the context here, is writing an error message for a bookkeeping app. That's up on the very top. So we think about the individual and we're like, okay, I need to create something for my user. And then we're like, nope, that's a group. I'm not gonna use user. I'm gonna think about a specific person who, if I know that we've done some research, we understand our customers, and freelance artists are the one who really use our bookkeeping app because we're designed for freelance artists. And we go a little bit further than that, right? If we can, we've done some studies and you watch a video and you see something from somebody named Malik and you really think about Malik when you are writing, right? Just that act alone will dramatically increase the empathy in your communications. So then we do the same process for a couple of other groups. So we've got a customer success manager, somebody on our team named Tiara. She might need to interact with this error message. And then you've got yourself, right? How can you be kind to yourself? That's self-empathy. Next, we've got some context, right? So we're thinking through the needs. So a freelance artist, all right. So they're on the go a lot, right? They're moving from project to project. It's going to be really important. And they're always feeling distracted. Right? If I've got a bookkeeping app, I've done some research and I know that nobody who's a freelance artist really gets excited about logging their receipts, right? So then what's the goal in that? Next is, the customer support. Like, a lot of times they're timed on how quickly they provide a resolution. Their compensation might even be tied to that. So is there a way that we can make their life easier, recognizing that? And then yourself. Think about yourself 6 months from now, where you've written this error message, but then there's, kind of little context. So what does each of these people need? It's going to be very different. You can start to see how different audiences need different things. Right? So that freelance artist, they're going to want resolution very quickly. They're going to want to understand very clear actions to take. If they get an error message that just says error, do you think that's going to help them feel empowered? Probably not. The customer success manager, they want accurate information. If something's changed and they're supposed to be following a different process and there's a library that comes up perhaps with different responses, they want to make sure that they're executing and calling the right one. And it needs to be easy to reference. If there's some bizarre kind of SharePoint something where they've got to dig like 9 layers down in order to access the information, that's going to be really challenging. And then yourself, there might be, you want to minimize your context switching. You don't want to have to dig around in 6 months and spend 3 hours trying to just kind of resurface and reacclimate yourself. You want to reduce that time as quickly as possible. So next we move into the action. Once we've kind of gotten a sense of who our audience is, what their context is, and then what they need from us, we then think about what we can do. So best action for Malik will probably be to validate his frustration. I love it when error messages do this, right? Second person active voice. This is a little copywriter trick. Talk to people through the screen and say you. We're sorry that you're experiencing this, or whatever. And use the very active voice, so talking about what they can do right now. It's in the moment. Because that's going to create the maximum amount of connection. And if you've distilled your audience down to a single person, this will come naturally. It will feel weird to write in a different way. The biggest reason the error messages are so poorly written is because we don't think about the individuals who are reading them. We are thinking about the machines that are executing them. So if we can just shift our focus slightly and form that connection to the person who is going to be reading our error message, it will make a massive difference. Customer success manager. Perhaps there's some kind of reference code in the error message so that, let's hypothetically say that they need to call customer service. That reference code then can pull up a very quick library, right? And ideally, maybe there's some kind of video tutorial that they could send. That would be best case. I would love it if that would be amazing, right? And maybe the best case scenario is that you just want to fix all the bugs. You don't want any edge cases, so you don't want to even have these error messages, right? That's something that you wish that you can do. Unfortunately, real life kicks in, and we do our feasibility analysis, and we realize we can't actually execute all of that right now. We've scoped out too much work. So what's the minimum that we can do right now that will add value? So for our freelance artist, we can definitely validate their frustration. That's not going to be that hard. We can write our error message in second person and active voice. That's not that hard. And maybe we can't create that whole video tutorial right now, but we can at least document the idea of it. That's not that hard, right? This is that verbose versus terse communication artifacts. The terse ones are the ones that you can usually execute really quickly. The verbose ones take a lot more time. The customer success manager, you could create an issue to document in some kind of reference idea. So again, you're documenting the idea of it even if you can't create this whole big thing. And, this happens frequently with us. Edge cases, as much as we would love to fix all of them, a lot of times that's just not feasible given the time and resources that we have. Sometimes they only pop up every so often, and dealing with them manually actually is the fastest way. And the menders in the audience who love fixing bugs, I can tell, you're just like, but that's not right. It's about balancing, right? So again, now we've figured out what are the specific things that I need to deliver, right? I need to make sure that I have a very well-written error message. Perhaps I collaborate with a copywriter in my group to make sure that that's written well. And maybe I update the wiki, right? Or create an issue in GitHub or Jira that say, this is something that I want to address later. Same thing with the customer success manager. And then for yourself, writing really clear intention-revealing code, using tests to describe the system, right? Writing a commit message that clearly describes what the changes that you're pushing out, and then using that documentation, right? That description field that so many of us forget. That's going to tightly couple our ideas to the source code. And then also perhaps doing an engineering journal. This is a practice that we do at Corgi Bytes. We just have a GitHub wiki. Everybody has their own, and it says Andrea's notes. And every day I write a journal about what are the different things that I did that day, right? That's where we get some of our best blog posts. That's where we get some of our best ideas. We can then collaborate with people really quickly because we can link to ideas while they're fresh, even though it's 6 months later. So, you kind of write up your ideas in a daily engineering journal. Solving for null and validating assumptions. So we talked about doing those listening sessions really early on, but it's not a one-time thing. You want to constantly be validating your research, right? So constantly conducting those listening sessions and asking, am I hitting this on the right level? You want to approach all of this with an idea of curiosity and respect. This is about compassion, and this is about courtesy as much as it is about trust. It's about making people's lives easier and knowing that we are the catalyst for that. It's incredibly empowering. And also recognizing that the goal of these listening sessions is not to change minds. It's to gather data and to meet people where they are. So in conclusion, there's a couple of key takeaways that I hope that you've learned from this time on stage. First is that empathy is a very technical topic. To simply say that empathy is feeling or putting yourself in someone else's shoes is just scratching the surface. There is so much research and so many ways to actually execute empathy. And I hope that this talk has given you a sense of how empathy can be just as analytical and rational and logical as it is a feeling state. Empathy is a skill that is developed through proactive perspective taking and problem solving. Rather than being reactive and just solving things as they come our way and fighting those fires, what if we worked on preventing them in the first place? Without empathy, you get an undesirable culture, whether that's a hero culture or one where there's bias or ones where people don't feel welcome. None of those things describe agile, right? Agile is about adapting to change and making sure that everyone on our team can contribute. And empathy-driven development, if you remember nothing else, it's about identifying your audience and then what action are you going to take? Audience action. Test-driven development is red, green, refactor. Empathy-driven development, audience action. And through all of this, it's about curiosity, respect, compassion, consideration. Yes, it's about the human side of connecting, but there is an analytical and logical and rational way to approach it. So that's what I've got. Thank you all so much, and do we have time for a few questions? Excellent. So I think there are a couple of microphones that are making their way around. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Anybody raise your hand if you have a question? Anyone? Aha, right in the center here. Can we get a microphone over to him, please? Oh, okay, the microphone stands over there. So there's two, and then there's another microphone over here, one. So if you have a question, please just get up and line up. Hello, sir, what's your name?
My name is, Louis Jacques.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to know, how do you break the hero pattern? Do you have a solution, a quick solution?
A quick solution. So I think the first step is to identify that you don't want a hero culture. If I was in a hero culture before, and part of the reason why I left, kind of the real world of jobs and started my own business was because I wanted to create the culture that I wanted to work in. So if you do find yourself in a hero culture, the first step would be talking about it, right? Because shame thrives on silence, secrecy, and judgment. So the first step is talking about the culture and how it's not productive. If you can tie that then, if you can do some research and tie it to business metrics, right? So there's for example, the diversity, right? Teams that are more diverse make more money, right? So the more that you can do that and have empathy with the people who are really focused on changing culture, so CEOs, that's their job, the more information that you can present to them, right? So a hero culture, if you've got turf building, then that means that it's harder for people to come on board because it takes a week to get a developer environment set up because somebody over here refuses to document the process and knows it all, right? It's not an easy problem. But the best way to do it is small and consistent and rational gains. And there are now enough companies out there who recognize that hero culture is toxic and have intentionally built organizations that don't have that. And so if you find yourself in an organization that has a hero culture and you are unable to change it, the term, I wish I could remember who quoted this originally, but my business partner says it a lot. If you can't change your environment, change your environment. So if you've done your best, perhaps you don't have the authority to kind of change the team, whole environment, you can take an action by finding another place to work. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, excellent. Well, thank you. Merci beaucoup. And I am so grateful. Thank you for all of your hospitality. And I'm looking forward to having more questions and answers immediately following this. Thank you all very much.